Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Sarawak Chief Minister Abang Johari Openg last week announced a new cabinet lineup following the resounding victory of the Gabungan Parti Sarawak coalition, which he led in the recent state elections. Now, what does the lineup reveal about the dynamics within GPS, the possibility of good governance in Sarawak, as well as the trajectory of politics in the territory? Joining us now to explore this, we have James Chin. He's a professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania in Australia. James, welcome to the show. It's good of you to join us. Thank you.
Good evening.
All right. So Abang Jo's cabinet lineup. Let's take a quick look at that. It comprises, I think, 10 ministers and 26 assistant ministers. We've got 3 deputy chief ministers, Douglas Uga, Awang Tengah, as well as Dr. Sim. I'm just wondering what you make of this very large cabinet.
Sure. I think the first place we start is with the numbers. So if you count the numbers of the ministers plus the assistant ministers, so basically the way to look at it is about 47% of those elected under GPS are now working directly for the state government, either inside cabinet or as an assistant minister. Probably about 10 to 15 more are appointed to statutory bodies. So basically anybody who was elected in the recent state elections in Sarawak were given some sort of positions either directly with the Sarawak state government or with one of the Sarawak GLCs. That having said that, in terms of the numbers, a lot of people said that how come you have 10 ministers? That is actually set by the Sarawak State Constitution, which actually set the number at 10. So it is actually the assistant minister that is interesting because the State Constitution is silent on that issue, so he can actually appoint as many as he wants. So this time he's appointed 26. What people do not realize is that on top of the elected YBs, there's another group of people who are also directly appointed by the chief ministers, and this is the political secretaries. He hasn't announced the number of political secretaries yet, but I suspect the numbers will be very large as well, probably another 20. So basically, we're talking about the whole governing administration of probably close to 100 people who are directly responsible to the chief minister and who are part of the Sarawak governing system.
James, how does this impact checks and balances if a good part of the legislature has been incorporated into the executive function of government?
The short answer is that there is no check and balance in Sarawak anymore. If you look at the election results, it's quite clear. 76 out of 82 seats went to the government. So when you talk about the opposition, you're talking about 6 members of the opposition. Out of the 6 members of the opposition, 2 are the DAP people who are long-term opposition people in Sarawak. The other 4 comes from the new political party PSB. And there are lots of suspicion in Sarawak that the PSB is not really opposition. They're sort of somewhere in the middle. Sometimes they're opposition, sometimes they're friendly to the government. So when you talk about opposition in Sarawak, for the next 5 years, the way I see it is that there really is no real opposition in Sarawak.
I was actually talking about the internal dynamics. Backbenchers do play, even if they're from the governing party, can play a check and balance role. And I wonder if you could comment on portfolios, because Abang Jo, as chief minister, has taken some other plum portfolios that traditionally, when you think of a Westminster-style government, form of government, you want to see keep the Prime Minister's position and the Minister of Finance separate as a sort of internal check, right? That's not happening in this cabinet, is it?
No, it's not. But to be fair to Abang Jo, right, this system where the chief minister holds all the plum positions or portfolios in cabinet was not actually started by him. It actually started during the era of his predecessor, Taib Mahmud, who's now the state governor. So in terms of Abang Jo, traditionally, the chief minister will hold the most important position, which is the chief minister's position. You also hold a thing called the Ministry of Natural Resources, which deals with things like timber licensing. So these are the 2 key ministries. The third one traditionally is a thing called infrastructure development. That has been broken up into different ministries, but that one traditionally was given to what they call DCM1, the Deputy Chief Minister 1. But that no longer exists. That ministry has been sort of redisputed into 4 or 5 different portfolios. But as I said very early on, there's really no opposition, even within on the government benches itself. If you read the handset of the Sarawak Assembly, Council Negeri, you'll find that very often, right, most of the GPS backbenchers do not really criticize the government on policy issue. Usually they use the Council Negeri as a place to ask for more allocation, to complain about services and infrastructure in their own constituency, rather than discuss policy issue, things like check and balance. This really doesn't come across their mind at all.
Okay, I think we're going to devote a little part of our conversation to talking about the future of an opposition in Sarawak. But I want to come back to the cabinet itself. Sharaad asking about the portfolios, and I'm just wondering, were there any naming of the ministers that were interesting or unexpected? And I'm looking particularly at the age range of those named and the gender imbalance. Only one woman was named as minister, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
That's correct. So again, that is nothing new. If you look at the previous Sarawak cabinet, there was only one female minister as well. The interesting thing about this cabinet compared to the others, one in all the other states in Malaysia, is that a lot of them have been there for many, many years. So Abang himself has been there since the 1980s. So a lot of them, like Awan Tengah, have been there for more than 20 years. Dr. Sim is there for about 10 years. So really, the key thing about the Sarawak cabinet is because they haven't had a change of government since 1970, it's all about people staying on for long periods of time. So if you talk about continuity in politics in Malaysia, right, the best place to look for is actually the Sarawak cabinet.
James, what about good governance? Because there's been a lot of talk about, at least coming from critics of Abang in the run-up to the election, that he's given to these sort of mega projects, many of which strike people there as unviable. The metro system in Kuching, the airline idea that he had, the hydrogen buses, and so on and so forth. What do you think Abang now must be on a real, he looks like his power is completely consolidated. Will there be pushback in terms of policy? How does he run his government, and what is it likely to look like?
So the way to understand it is that a lot of people see Abang as an ideas person. He's got all these big ideas, but in terms of implementation, basically a lot of the big ideas that you spoke about, he has not come to fruition yet. The hydrogen buses was actually running for a little while, and I think they got into a bit of mechanical issues. So now it's back to the drawing board. In terms of the so-called monorail system linking Kuching to Kota Semarahan, that is still on the drawing board. And of course, the airline idea was floated just before the election. So a lot of these ideas are what we might call big ideas. I think he will still push for it in cabinet, but I think there will be a lot of discussion about this. A lot of these ideas requires huge investments. Sarawak has a surplus about 30 billion ringgit sitting in its coffers. And of course, last year they did a special deal with the federal government where Petronas was asked to pay additional taxes, sales tax in Sarawak. So that will bring a few additional billion ringgit into Sarawak. So in terms of the money, they probably have the money to do it. Now, the issue is that whether they can do it within the lifespan of the next 5 years. My take is that a lot of these big ideas, probably maybe 1 out of 5 or 6 of them will be implemented. The rest will just die naturally.
Is that the GPS philosophy then, James? I mean, Abang big ideas, very futuristic, pushing Sarawak into IR 4.0. Is that embraced by the GPS coalition?
Well, it's not really a political philosophy per se. The political philosophy of GPS is actually very unique within the Malaysian political system. So the way to understand GPS political philosophy is to understand their tagline. Their tagline is to think of Sarawak first. And in many ways, that's actually explain everything what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do in Sarawak is to ring fence Sarawak from what they perceive to be toxic political culture from Peninsular Malaysia or Malaya, and they do not want to import this sort of racial, religious, Malay versus non-Malays, Islam versus non-Islam sort of political culture in Sarawak. So they're trying to ring fence Sarawak and have this very strong sense of Sharaad nationalism, a sort of very strong sense of Sharaad political culture. So that actually is what GPS is trying to do, and that is really the cornerstone of this Sharaad first policy.
Can I ask you though, James, just a second, Sharaad, to follow up with James? Can I ask you? I mean, Sarawak often prides itself on not sharing Malaya's politics of racial and religious supremacy, and I'm just wondering, this Think Sarawak First political philosophy of GPS, is that true? Does it really reflect the situation in Sarawak?
Well, it depends on who you talk to, but I think by and large, I think most people in Sarawak and also most people outside Sarawak will agree that racial relations in Sarawak is a lot better when you compare to places like Sabah or Malaya. So as a whole, the example that they like to give all the time is that if you go to most kopitiams in Sarawak, you'll find that halal food is served next to a non-halal, a non-halal food outlet. So I think by and large, racial relations, religious relations in Sarawak is a lot better compared to the rest of Malaysia. But having said that, there are some religious tensions in Sarawak. One of the problems with Sharaad now is that, PAS has been there for almost 10 to 15 years. They've been very active on the ground. But much more importantly, for the past 50 years, a lot of Sarawak students have actually spent a lot of time in Malaya, in Peninsular Malaysia. And some of these people, when they go back to Sarawak, they bring funny ideas about Malayan politics, which they want to import into Sarawak. So yes, on the one hand, I think racial and religious relations are a lot better compared to Peninsular Malaysia. But at the same time, there are attempts to import the Peninsula type of politics into Sarawak, but not very successful. And for that, I think whether you like it or not, you have to say that GPS has done a good job in rejecting the Malayan type of politics.
Okay, James, we're going to take a quick break, but let's come back and continue this conversation. Still a lot to cover on this. We'll be right back. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, thanks so much for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad, Kuttan, and we're speaking to James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at University of Tasmania. We're looking at the trajectory of Sarawak politics following the recent elections, as well as the naming of the Sarawak cabinet lineup. And I want to take a quick look at the results of the elections, James. Winning 93% of the seats, GPS achieved a resounding victory, but I want to take a look at voter behavior. Some commentators had described this as a quote-unquote voter flight to safety. And I wanted to ask you whether you agree with this assessment of voter behavior.
So I don't think it's anything to do with voter flight to safety. I think there were several things happening. I think the first thing that you need to look out for is the turnout. The turnout was very low in the urban areas. And I think there were two reasons for that. One was that the urban Chinese were very unhappy with the opposition DAP. So a lot of them used the excuse of COVID not to come out to vote. Because as you know, right, in most urban areas, if the turnout is very high, then the DAP will get most of the urban votes. So in core areas of Pandungan, the turnout was less than 50%. So that's the reason why GPS did very well because of the turnout rate. I think the second factor was really the SOP. I think the SOP really hindered a lot of the opposition type of campaigning. As you know, the opposition campaigning traditionally is always based on the very personal touch. They hold a lot of huge rallies, all that sort of thing. So all that sort of thing went out the window. They couldn't do any of those things. So they could not build up momentum. And I think another very important factor is that the opposition was highly divided this time. As many of the viewers know, right, despite the mantra that they were part of Pakatan Harapan, in fact, they were not Pakatan Harapan at all. DAP used the Orchid logo, PKR used their own logo, Amanah used their own logo. So basically, the opposition was highly divided. And on top of that, you had a very strong Sharaad nationalistic party, Parti Bumi Kingalang, and PSB. So if you add up all the factors together, right, you will see it is very, very clear that that the reason why the opposition, the mainstream opposition, did very badly was because They were just too disunited, and there were two strong Sharaad nationalistic party coming online, which captured a lot of the votes that would traditionally have gone to them.
Okay, can we talk a bit about that, James? The call for not just autonomy. In the case of Parti Bumi Kenyalang, it was actually outright independence. Seen as by some as potentially a vote getter, but they, as a party, having I think fielded about 70, candidates, didn't get a single one into the assembly. So, but how do you rate their success in this particular round? Is independence not the vote getter that it was said to be?
So the way I've always explained it is that parties that stand for single issue like PBK, which wants Sarawak to be independent or get out of Malaysia, single issue parties don't do very well. Although the issue of succession or the issue of more autonomy or getting out of Malaysia or renegotiating MS-63, these are extremely popular issues among the Sarawak electorate. They don't vote on the single issue alone. So in other words, if you want to play on the succession issue or Sarawak's independence, you have to attach this to other things as well. So parties like PBK, which only had a single issue, they could not sell this idea or they could not sell this product well in Sarawak. I think two other things were happening. One is that PBK did very badly because a lot of these candidates were not credible candidates. Everybody knew that among PBS, 80 or 90% of the candidates were basically people who, under ordinary circumstances, would not even be candidates at all. The other thing I think that was happening among those people who wanted Sarawak to head towards independence, I think a lot of them realized that independence is not as simple as PBK says. PBK says that if we capture the Sarawak government, we were going to hold a special sitting of the Council Negeri, declare UDI, declare independence, and from there we negotiate with Putrajaya to secede from Malaysia. Everybody understood that it's not as simple as that. And I think there's also this thing about Malaysian political culture where there was a fear element as well. There are a lot of people who may support the idea of succession from Malaysia. They understood that if PBK were to win government, right, then it is very obvious. I'm sure you agree with me that it was very obvious that Putrajaya will immediately declare a state of emergency and take over the Sarawak government. Putrajaya was definitely not going to, sit there and do nothing in PBK, a party that says that we're going to take Sarawak out of Malaysia. If you were to win election, I'm very, very sure on that night, Putrajaya will declare a state of emergency in Sarawak. So I think a lot of people understood that. And so although they may be sympathetic to the idea of, Sarawak pulling out of Malaysia, they knew the risk was too high. So they did not really go for PBK.
I want to focus on the performance of DAP, particularly, and looking at the future of DAP. I mean, DAP only secured 2 seats, right? And that was just a third of the seats that they had won in 2016 previously. It looks like Harapan is no longer the leading opposition in Sarawak. And as you mentioned a bit earlier, maybe there might not even be a credible opposition in Sarawak. But I'm just wondering whether this development, the poor performance of DAP Harapan in Sarawak in the recent elections, whether that foreshadows any of the changes taking place perhaps at the national level. Does the intensity of the defeat speak to the audience in Malaysian politics at the federal level?
So the short answer is no. What happens in Sarawak politics is basically confined to the Sarawak borders. I think a lot of people has not really understood what happened to the DAP. The way to look at DAP's defeat is not only that the Chinese were unhappy with DAP, but for the very first time in a long time, DAP no longer has any elected representative at the state level for the whole of Sarawak other than Kuching. DAP seats won were actually in Kuching. So you can imagine all the other urban centers like Bintulu, the Rejan Delta, Sibu, Bintangor, Triangle, Upper Emiri, all those places where there are large pockets of Chinese population, right? There is no more DAP representation over there. So this is a major change. This, in fact, is much more important than the DAP, losing their number of seats. So the way for the DAP to move forward is that they really have to do a bit of soul searching. Everybody understands that there is a problem with the leadership structure in Sarawak. They've not admitted to it, but I think it is widely understood, even though admitted to it, everybody is talking about it in the shadows. And the DAP really have to do a bit of soul searching, because it is my prediction that the general elections will be held this year very soon. And if DAP doesn't get its act right, it will lose its parliamentary seat as well.
James, what happens now with the young? Because we know that the young voters, those 18 and between 18 and 21, were kind of left out of these particular polls, but they will be there for the general elections. Is there any sense of where they are? I mean, maybe in multiple directions are headed.
Sure, in terms of the young voters in Sharaad, I think the conventional wisdom is that young people, 18, 19, 20-year-old, once you give them the vote, these people have anti-establishment tendencies. They tend to vote against the government. I've always argued that this may not be true, and this especially may not be true of the youth in East Malaysia, in both Sabah and Sarawak. One of the reasons is because the political culture in Sabah and Sarawak are very, very different. And secondly, all the major locally based parties in Sarawak, they've already started engaging the young people. The GPS, as a coalition, right, they've actually created a couple of fake NGOs or fake CSOs that has been going all out to engage the young people of Sarawak. You see, the thing about GPS is that they're very clever. By selling this Sarawak nationalism, Sarawak first philosophy, right, this is also very attractive to the young people. So it is not a question about opposing the government. It's all about the rise of state nationalism. So basically, they're selling the product. We're trying to protect Sarawak from the rest of Malaysia. We're trying to create something special in Sarawak. We're trying to protect Sarawak's borders. We're trying to create a Sarawak political culture. And if you really love Sarawak, you should be supporting us because we are Sarawak first. So in fact, if you look at a lot of the young people, right? I mean, personally, I've seen a lot of young people. They've actually expressed support for GPS, especially in social media. So I'm not too sure about this thing that the young people will go against the government. This may be true in some pockets in Peninsular Malaysia, but it's certainly not true in Sabah and Sarawak.
Where do you see the future trajectory of Sarawak at the moment, James? I mean, if the GPS and its political philosophy seems to be gaining some kind of traction and foothold, and Abang has received this enormous mandate as reflected by the results of the previous elections, or the past elections, where do you see the political scenario in Sarawak heading? And more importantly, the governance, the good governance of the territory, where is that heading?
Okay, so I'll answer the second part first. In terms of good governance, you can forget it. There's no check and balance. But in terms of the trajectory for Sarawak politics, I see the rise of Sarawak nationalism. I see GPS getting more and more powerful, and I see GPS getting more and more concessions, especially in the area of autonomy from Putrajaya. So I expect GPS to consolidate under this Sarawak first philosophy, and I suspect GPS not only will play this card very well, but they will position themselves to win more parliamentary elections next time around, GE15. And their aim is probably to win as many of the 31 parliamentary seats in Sarawak as possible so that they can play the role of kingmaker when the new government is made in Putrajaya. So basically, the way to understand GPS is that they've latched onto a thing called Sarawak nationalism. This product is selling very well in Sarawak. It's been proven by the state elections. They're going to sell the same product in the upcoming GE15. And if they win additional seats, as a bloc, they'll become much more powerful, and Putrajaya will find it harder and harder to deal with Sarawak.
James, thank you so much for joining us on the show and sharing your insights with us. We appreciate your time. Thank you. That was